Now, the 18-pounder field gun is an iconic image, an iconic piece of material from the Civil War, especially to do with the bombardment of the forecourts. And in our next paper, Sergeant Robert Delaney is going to discuss his work on the preservation and restoration of the 18-pounder field gun. Sergeant Robert Delaney is an armament officer with the Army, with the Ordnance Corps, and he recently led a team working on the preservation and restoration of one of the original 18-pounders that were handed over to the National Army in 1922. And this field gun took part in the entire Civil War, took part throughout it, and was present at many key battles throughout the conflict. Sergeant Delaney is currently studying for an MLit in Maynooth University, with his research focusing on the quick-firing 18-pounder field gun. If you please welcome Sergeant Robert Delaney.
Thank you, sir. And I'd like to thank the Military History Society and Military Archives for having me here. And I owe the Military Archives an awful lot more, really, having done the MLit and spent so much time up there in the past couple of years. That's great, thanks. Okay. The 18-pounder, as the Commandant said there, the 18-pounder we have in the Curragh, we've recently been able to prove that it was one of the Civil War guns. It's hard to identify exactly where it served, but the fact that it was one of the Mark IIs indicates that it would have been there from the start. The 18-pounder itself was the heaviest piece of weaponry wielded by either side during the Civil War. And although it was deployed on just a limited number of occasions, it without doubt gave the Free State side an advantage during the conventional phase of the conflict. It could in fact be said that it helped to change the course of the war, as anti-treaty commanders realised they'd no answer to artillery fire and evacuated the fixed positions that they held in cities and towns. The quick-firing 18-pounder was one of the heaviest field guns in service at the time, and it packed a substantial punch. Designed in the wake of the Second Anglo-Boer War, its design was influenced by the lessons learned in South Africa, and the gun is widely recognised as one of the greatest artillery pieces of the age. The term quick-firing referred to the speed with which a round could be loaded and fired, and the gun made ready to fire again. And this was made possible by the design of the gun's breech and its firing mechanism, and by the recoil system, which was mounted on top of the ordnance. There were two variants of the weapon in use during the Civil War, and these are very visible in the film footage, contemporary film footage, and photographs from the time. The one on top you can see is the Mark I 18-pounder, and it's recognisable by the box-type tank. This was part of the improvements that were made during the Great War when they started having problems with their recoil systems. The lower one then is the Mark II. These were the first ones that we got from the British. And it's really the change between, or the difference between the two is in the recoil system. No one could have imagined the amount of rounds that these weapons were expected to fire during the First World War when they were initially designed in the early 1900s. And the recoil systems really took a hammering. Part of the improvement was a new recoil system which was a hydropneumatic recoil system. The British finally went the way of the French and went hydropneumatic. The Mark I used springs instead of air. The Mark II is very recognisable by the dome-shaped, the torpedo-shaped bronze dome on the front of the recoil system. There were 9 18-pounder field guns in the Free State arsenal during the Civil War, and these were really the main guns of the artillery corps during the early years of the 1920s. You can see here in the list, number 9168 is the gun, the third one down there, that's the one that we have in the Curragh. And it was part of those first 4, the Mark IIs were the ones that we got first off the British during the battle in Dublin. However, before the outbreak of the Civil War, the Free State Army had no artillery capability. It only came with the handover of the first two 18-pounders. In March 1922, General Macready, looking on in Dublin, reported back to London that cavalry and artillery are not contemplated at present. In May that year, Michael Collins asked Winston Churchill for mortars when it looked like the pact with De Valera was about to collapse. And Winston Churchill, 2 weeks later, offered Collins a mortar only if it was to be used against the forecourts. So you can see in that already by May they were thinking that heavy weaponry was going to be needed to deal with the forecourts. Lloyd George's offer of the necessary pieces of artillery, we saw that yesterday, came with his ultimatum on the 22nd of June, after the assassination of Field Marshal Wilson. And the matter of borrowing British field guns seems to have been discussed the next day between Arthur Griffith and Assistant Under Secretary Cope in Dublin at a secret meeting. As events in Dublin took over, the first pair of Mark II 18-pounders were accepted and collected from the back gate of Marlborough Barracks, now McKee, taken from the 17th Battery Royal Field Artillery. During the battle for the forecourts, two more 18-pounders were taken on, the same variant from the same battery. It really rendered this battery ineffective, and the battery itself it absorbed the 112th Battery Royal Field Artillery, which was at that time based in India, and although this really seems to have been just a paper exercise to keep the 17th battery going. The 5 Mark I's that you could see in the lower part of the list were taken on in the week or two that followed. Getting the guns was one thing, using them was another, and the initial action at the forecourts proved just how unused to artillery the Free State Army was. None of the Free State officers who collected the first two 18-pounders were artillerymen. Major General Emmett Dalton, who we heard about yesterday, was in charge of the operation, and he'd seen plenty of action during the Great War, but he was an infantry officer. Commandant Tony Lawler, seen here in this image, had been training some of his men in Athlone on an old 15-pounder. It's probably this gun that you can see in this photograph, which had been left behind by the British. But Lawler's Great War service was with the Royal Flying Corps, and the training doesn't really seem to have been officially sanctioned. In fact, the only one who really knew anything about artillery was Captain Johnny Doyle. You can see him here on the left of this photograph. He was an ex-Royal Navy man, a qualified armament artificer, a fitter for heavy weapons. Doyle was later given the title of the Army's first artilleryman because he fired the first shot from one of the 18-pounders on the Keys. But he was, in fact, I'm delighted to say, a member of the Ordnance Corps. The shot that Doyle fired, generally accepted as the first official shot of the Civil War, was fired from 18-pounder serial number 10756 at 4:15 a.m. on the 28th of June from a position on Wine Tavern Street just across the Liffey from the forecourts. The lack of experience with artillery in the new Free State Army, however, became very apparent during the operation at the courts. Stories say that the first round went flying over the courts and the field gun was sent skidding across the cobblestones because the gunners had failed to dig the spade at the rear of the trail of the gun into the ground. It was a basic mistake, but it was quickly rectified, and subsequent images of the fighting in Dublin, you can see the spades well dug in. Some of them, the toe and eye is resting right on top of the cobblestones. The pick and the shovel became the gunner's friend in the Dublin fighting. Rounds were sent over the courts again during the battle, this time landing in the grounds of the Royal Hospital in Kilmainham, where General Macready had his headquarters. These shots were fired by an over-enthusiastic Captain Ignatius O'Neill from the northeast side of the courts, who was using the field gun as he would his rifle, trying to hit a sniper up near the dome. The Boers had used their artillery in a similar way during the South African War, and it was a characteristic perhaps of a soldier who was proficient in the use of small calibre weaponry but unused to artillery. Another potentially fatal incident occurred on Little Strand Street to the east of the courts, when a gun crew failed to check for a clear line of sight between the muzzle of the gun and the target, and they fired a shell that struck a lamppost directly in front of them. It caused huge damage, but amazingly no one seems to be hurt, and the gun was taken out of action straight away. It's been claimed that the gunners aimed by simply looking down the barrel with the breech open, The film footage and photographs, this is a still from one of the films, shows that the gun, or the layer on the left of the photograph on the top there, using the open sights of the gun, which are basically like the orange sights on a rifle. Anyway, the facade of the forecourts was 450 yards long, 120 yards away, across the Liffey from the guns, so it wasn't going to be hard to hit it. Though damage to the quay walls in front of the guns indicates that on occasion the barrels were depressed too much. Emmett Dalton admitted later that he knew the 18-pounder might not be the most suitable weapon to use against the forecourts, and at times during the operation it certainly seemed that it might not be up to the job. But Dalton hoped that 18-pounder shells would have a very demoralising effect upon a garrison unused to artillery. Later, during the bombardment in Waterford, Commandant Patrick Paul made a similar statement. He was obviously thinking along the same lines. They were depending on the morale effect, one of the primary effects that artillery fire has on an enemy. And it's clear that at the forecourts, it was hoped the bombardment would shock the defending garrison into surrendering. And during the first hours of the attack, the entire southern facade of the building was raked with shell fire. Michael Fewer's study of the battle, he's done this excellent assessment of where the main strikes were during that part of the battle. Although one of those inside the courts was so unimpressed, he suggested that the guns must have been bought in Woolworths. Probably today you'd say pennies. The reason for this is likely to have been the use of shrapnel shells. Most sources claim that Macready only handed shrapnel shells over to the provisional government before the battle, and these proved useless against the 3-foot thick granite walls of the forecourts. They may as well have been thrown peaches at them, Dalton later confessed. You can see here the effect of what was probably a hit from a shrapnel round, and there's no doubt that poor gunnery combined with the supply of the wrong ammunition and shortages later of ammunition caused the operation at the courts to drag on a lot longer than it should have. During the battle, the guns were fired from at least 5 positions around the courts complex. And I would suggest that at least 3 of the guns were deployed during the battle, perhaps all 4. And during our work on gun number 9168 down in the Curragh, we spent a lot of time checking the shield of the gun for damage, and there's no sign. During the battle you hear a lot about rounds being hopped off the cobblestones to get up under the shields, but you also hear O'Duffy reported that they were actually holding the shields with some of the rounds they were firing. But there's no sign of any bullet damage to the shield of gun number 9168. There's also no sign that the shields were replaced later during Free State times. They didn't buy, it doesn't seem that they bought spare shields. So it would suggest that 9168, if it was deployed at the battle, was positioned at some stage where the anti-treaty side weren't able to fire back. That could have been on the quays later on during the battle, or possibly it was the gun that fired from Little Strand Street into the lamppost. The arrival of the second pair of guns, second pair of 18-pounders during the battle for the courts coincided with a change of plan. And Free State Army commanders realised that they'd have to storm the building. The morale effect simply wasn't working. Before storming the building, they'd have to use the artillery to make a breach for the infantry to storm through. Shell fire became more focused, and 2 areas in particular were targeted. Morgan Place, you can see it on the right-hand photograph, off the quays, and the Records House on the western side of the courts. The gun that fired from Bridge Street on the south quays onto Morgan Place had a particularly difficult arc of fire, as Paddy O'Daly and the Dublin Guards were in the Forecourts Hotel, which is the building standing in the left of that photograph, waiting for the off. So it made a very narrow arc of fire to strike for the Bridge Street gun. There's no doubt, and this has been confirmed with work I did with the 25th and 26th Young Officers courses in the Ordnance School, that high explosive shells were responsible for the massive breaches that were opened in the walls of the courts later in the battle, during the second day of the attack. And once HE shells, once high explosive shells were supplied by the British, doubts about the capability of the 18-pounder were eliminated. The point and shoot capability of the gun in the direct fire role must have appealed to Free State officers. And within days of the first shells crashing against the walls of the courts, the provisional government had 18-pounders attached to military columns advancing from Dublin towards Drogheda, Blessington, Wexford and Roscommon. Ralph Riccio, in his book on Irish artillery, has made the point that the deployment of a new weapon like that, so far from the capital, so early in the war, was a daring move by the headquarters. The rapid nationwide descent into civil war saw anti-treaty troops seize ground in areas where provisional government forces were only thinly spread. To gain a foothold, in these areas, the Free State side had to capture major towns. And whilst artillery wasn't used on every occasion, battles for towns like Drogheda and Boyle and the cities of Limerick and Waterford were quickly decided, often after days of fighting, once the 18-pounder arrived. One of the guns, the same one that breached the western side of the forecourts, was used against the block on O'Connell Street and on the 4th of July. Tactically, the use of the gun here really made no sense, and it seems that it was just used sheerly for the destructive effect. The same day, gun number 10756, the one that fired the first shots, fired on the anti-treaty held fort on Millmount in Drogheda. It breached the outer wall and opened a massive rupture in the Martello Tower on the hill. You can see really in all the photographs from these breaching operations, it's a similar linear type breach where they were just constantly firing rounds into the same part of the wall, and the upper section of the wall, I presume, collapsed. The shelling in Millmount stands out because it was the first use of the 18-pounder outside Dublin. The gun fired at a longer range, around 1,300 yards, and the history sheet for the weapon, which is the only history sheet to survive, records that 40 rounds were fired. The ranging shots overshot the target initially and landed in fields behind. One of the two guns that were sent to Limerick was used in a breaching operation there against the anti-treaty force in the Strand Barracks. We heard from Pádraig yesterday about that part of the battle. Like the fighting in Dublin, the guns fired from a position less than 200 yards from the target, and a massive hole was blown in the front wall of the barracks. Later on, an even bigger hole blown in the rear. 36 rounds were fired against the Strand Barracks in all. The battle for Limerick had been raging for more than a week before the gun arrived in the city. But as the Strand Barracks fell and Free State gunners prepared to bombard the Castle Barracks the next day, Republicans commenced the withdrawal from the city. The 18-pounder saw action between 25 and 30 times during the first 3 months of the war. And from early on, commanders in the field appreciated the value of the field gun. You can see here a list of most of the major actions with the ranges that the guns were employed or deployed at, and very approximate number of rounds. The only history sheet to survive is that of 10756. The other information for numbers around really is from newspapers or sometimes military reports. The forecourts operation had only finished when the Free State headquarters began receiving requests from commanders looking for an artillery piece for their area of operations. But there simply wasn't enough to go round. From the outset, Republicans admitted that the Free State people can reduce any position with artillery. And during the fighting in Dublin, some wanted to avoid that possibility by pursuing a guerrilla campaign early on. I think the date of Liam Lynch's quote seen here is significant, as it came in the week after that some of the most noteworthy operations happened that involved artillery. The amateur use of the 18-pounder that was visible in Dublin in June and early July improved somewhat as the weeks passed, and ex-Royal Artillery gunners answered to provisional government's call to arms. The gun crew that manned the 18-pounder in Limerick had all served previously with the Royal Artillery. Later, film footage, and this is a still from just one of the engagements, showed the gun crew acting as a Royal Artillery detachment would operate. In Waterford, Commandant Patrick Paul, who we heard about already, was in charge of the gun. And he was an ex-Royal Artillery officer. His expertise is evident. Shrapnel was fired for adjustment before high explosive rounds were fired for effect. Paul's gun crew too seemed to have been proficient in the use of the weapon. When the Waterford Free State Force under General Prout was attacked on the right flank from a position in Kilcash Castle during the advance on Clonmel, the 18-pounder was brought into action at a range of around 2,000 yards. 2 rounds of shrapnel were fired above the ruin before one HE was fired into the wall of the castle where the anti-treaty machine gunner had been. The same gun had been used to force a body of Republicans to retreat after they had attacked from Craig Wood during the advance on Carrigon Shore a few days earlier. On that occasion, an observer in a tree directed fire, and a few shells were enough to fend off the attack. During the war, ranges generally were short. The longest taken on was approximately 3,000 yards. This seems to have been about 3,000 yards were fired at in Kilmallock, and also the gun that was used on the Inishowen Peninsula to fire at Fatten or at Inch Fort on Inch Island engaged the target at around 3,000 yards. When not used to bombard anti-treaty held positions, the 18-pounder was sometimes deployed in an interesting way. Contemporary artillery doctrine would call it an accompanying gun. Basically, it was a heavy support weapon to be used by the Free State Army commander as required during the advance into Republican-held territory. For these operations, it was generally deployed in the direct fire role, and ranges usually were short. This meant that the gun was almost always within range of enemy fire. One of the primary targets for the accompanying field gun, according to field artillery doctrine, was the enemy machine gun position. There are plenty of accounts about the Free State advance stalling before anti-treaty machine gun positions, which were subsequently neutralised by the 18-pounder. The infantry assault on Brewery in Limerick, which could actually be from this piece of footage, was delayed by a machine gunner near the railway line. The 18-pounder was dug in a field about 800 yards away, and though the first shell landed short, it was enough to make the machine gunner think twice about continuing his defence. In the east of the country, a National Army column clearing the area north of Dundalk came under fire from a machine gun on Trumpet Hill near Ravensdale. In response, the 18-pounder, a Mark I variant, fired 6 rounds, which must have included a couple of ranging rounds. Incoming machine gun fire from the Protestant church tower outside Adair held up the Free State advance into West Limerick on the 4th of August. Republicans in the town had established their defences in depth, the finest you could possibly get, according to National Army officer Brigadier Tom Keogh. And the 18-pounder had to be towed into a firing position by the Rolls-Royce armoured car. The anti-treaty machine gun position in the tower was neutralised and the town was shelled. The after-action report exclaimed that Lieutenant Tracy was in great form with the big gun. In Cork, during the fighting around Rochestown and Douglas, the 18-pounder was called up when required to neutralise some extremely well-defended anti-treaty positions, one of which was fortified with 3 machine gun posts. The history sheet for gun number 10756, which was one of the guns that was sent to Cork, shows that it fired 25 rounds during the 3-day battle down there. By far, the most conventional use of the field gun was seen during the battle for Kilmallock that we heard about yesterday, on the 4th and 5th of August. It was part of the same operation that included the attack on Adair, and General W.R.E. Murphy, the Great War veteran, was in charge. So the the operational order seen here, was very detailed. The 18-pounder was positioned on Drummond Hill, 3 miles north of the town, and from this commanding position, it was used to engage anti-treaty strong points to assist the Free State infantry advance. The gun seems to have been fired indirectly, and it may have been fitted with a dial sight. There's a report in military archives, in the Mulcahy papers, from the day of the battle, looking for a dial sight to be sent down to them. Fire was directed by an observation officer on the battlefield using signal flags, and to avoid hitting friendly troops, the front line was indicated every hour using flares. Shrapnel proved very effective against anti-treaty defenders during the battle, who were in well-established positions around the town of Kilmallock. And a newspaper reporter summed up the battle by saying, had it not been for the timely assistance of the gun, it is likely the troops would still be held up before Kilmallock Hill. Now, I think it's important to mention at this point the casualties that are known to have occurred due to shell fire. Considering the number of shells fired at the forecourts, casualties were extremely low. Those shrapnel wounds are mentioned, and some of those involved suffered with shell shock later on. One Republican was wounded during the brief engagement at Ravensdale near Dundalk, and according to locals, the shelling in the quarries outside Kilmallock caused severe casualties. But surprisingly, it seems that most of those on the receiving end of the 18-pounders fire survived, probably fleeing before they were hit. The only death, and we heard about it yesterday, that's specifically attributed to an artillery attack is that of Mary Hartney, a member of Cumann na mBan who was stationed in the Republican aid post in Adair. The lethal effect of shell fire left her 2 daughters without a mother. During the design phase of the 18-pounder in the early 1900s, its weight was dictated by that which would be hauled by 6 horses. And with the 2-wheel limber wagon, this is how the Royal Artillery moved their guns. But during the war in Ireland, almost every means available was used to transport the 18-pounder except the team of horses. Generally, the gun was hauled mechanically by a Lancia armour car, which was also used to shield the gun crew when firing. But there are times when a commandeered civilian lorry was used to pull or carry the field gun Portee style. Pádraig yesterday had a fantastic photo I'd never seen of the gun being carried Portee style in the back of a steam lorry. There are only 2 cases where horsepower was actually employed. At Kilmallock, there was difficulties getting the towing vehicle into the field to tow the gun into action. So they commandeered a Royal Field Artillery horse, which was being used by a farmer nearby. The horse pulled the gun into the firing position on Drummond Hill. And an old plough horse named Dolly hauled the 18-pounder that was landed at Feenet, the 8 miles to Tralee. But the only time the teams of horses were used during the Civil War were for funerals, towing the gun carriages. The first was Captain Luke Condren, and then, of course, later that of General Michael Collins. 5 18-pounders were shipped on 4 of the maritime landings that took place, and 1 was shipped on a resupply mission up to Buncrana. The ease with which the gun could be manoeuvred made it easier to load and unload than the armoured vehicles. The guns were also transported by rail. 2 were sent to Neenah by train before the assault on the Strand Barracks in Limerick, and 1 was loaded onto an armoured train to bring it north when the Free State Army was endeavouring to retake Dundalk during the middle of August. Now, as an artificer, I have a particular interest in the workings of the 18-pounder, and I was intrigued to learn about mechanical problems that occurred during the conflict. Records are scarce, but it appears that 2 Mark I variants that were handed of the Mark I variants that were handed over by the British may have been lying up out of use for some time. And there were major problems, 2 major incidents with the guns. The recoil system seemed to have been completely neglected prior to the handover, and both of these guns required a massive amount of work to repair them to get them back into action. General Mulcahy was so convinced that the fault lay with the British that he wrote to Under Secretary Cope to advise on the best way forward with the matter should the provisional government have to pay for the weapons. But the guns may in fact never have been paid for. British parliamentarians at the time were eager to find out if the 18-pounders were on loan from the Royal Artillery or transferred permanently to the Free State. No official record of the handover exists, and the guns may have been included on issue vouchers for equipment valued at more than £150,000, covering the months of June, July and August 1922. Unfortunately, the vouchers aren't itemised. During the chaos of the early months of the Civil War, there seems to have been only scant records kept about what was being handed over. Winston Churchill maintained that all munitions will be included in the financial settlement to be made later between the 2 governments. That settlement dragged on into the 1920s. The Irish Department of Finance persistently asked the British for a breakdown of costs in the estimation of the final bill of nearly £500,000 until 1926, when apparently unable or perhaps unwilling to do so, the British eventually abandoned their claim altogether. And now I leave you with a quote from a rather strange, probably fictional story that was published in on Toglach in 1923 about the 18-pounder being used down in Cork. It's almost like something from the 1960s. They're talking about putting flowers into the recoil system and as they meet some of the local girls in Cork. But I think the last line of that piece there sums up our experience in ordnance-based workshops during our time working with 18-pounder serial number 9168. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for a fascinating paper on an iconic weapon from the Civil War.